Thank you for joining us. My name is Joe Carr, and I'm happy to welcome you to the Providence College podcast. Our guest today is Dr. Jeff Johnson, a professor in PC's Department of History and Classics. For several years, Dr. Johnson has been director of the American Studies program, and as of July 1st, he will become director of the History graduate programs here at Providence College. Our conversation covered his scholarship, his participation in a national program aimed at helping high school teachers enhance their subject area mastery, and our shared interest in fictional depictions of the American West. We began by talking about his pathway to Providence College. Jeff, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Joe. This is a real honor. Thanks for having me.
Rhode Island is a long way from where you grew up. Tell us about what brought you to Providence College.
Yeah, that's right. I always like to tell people that I'm an immigrant on the East Coast. My dad was in the Air Force, and so I moved around growing up and never lived in one place more than 3 or 4 years, but almost always lived in the American West. And so I was born in upstate New York, and then by the age of 2 had moved to Alaska, and then there was a stint in Oklahoma, and then there was a stint in Southern California, and eventually ended up in Wyoming, and was there through junior high and high school. I went to college in Montana, and then I went to graduate.
At a college somewhat similar to PC?
Very much so, yeah. I went to Carroll College in Helena, and it's a small liberal arts Catholic school. And so had a really, I think, excellent time and training there. And then my advisor had been a graduate student at Washington State and said, hey, I think you should think about Washington State for graduate school. And I was first generation college. And so graduate school wasn't on my radar. And I applied and caught them at a weak moment and ended up studying at Washington State and finishing there in 2004. And it was a great place as well. So when I finished in graduate school, I taught in South Dakota at Augustana University. It used to be Augustana College. They're now Augustana University for 4 years. And then saw the ad at Providence College, and it caught my eye. The history department was looking for somebody that taught political history, modern political history, and labor history, and I fit that pretty well. So that's how I ended up at Providence. So,
do you remember when it first came into your consciousness, the idea that you might become a history professor?
Yes, I do. I remember that moment very vividly. That's a really good question. I was sitting in a college classroom as a sophomore, and my professor was describing, my mentor was describing in the lecture hall one of the elections, either 1824, 1828, and I think it was Andrew Jackson, and sort of the dirty politics of all of that. And I just remember being stunned and sitting there and thinking, I want that job. And trying to figure out the way, again, not really knowing a lot about graduate school or how any of this worked, thinking, what do I have to do to get that job? And so that's how I sort of went down that path. But that was the precise moment, somewhere in the fall of 1999.
A turning point.
It was.
That's right.
It really was.
Let's talk a little bit about this department that you're a part of, the Department of History and Classics. A few of your faculty colleagues have been podcast guests already, and great stories to tell. Lots going on here, lots of interesting scholarship, very engaged students. What's it like to be part of a faculty group like this one?
The first thing I can tell you is it is an incredibly collegial group. And I have a lot of colleagues who I just really consider friends, and that really makes for an incredible work relationship with folks. And so it's a really collegial department. And I think a lot of my colleagues would say that would be one of the first things that they would say about the department too. It's a department that kind of looks out for others. Again, it was part of what attracted me to coming to Providence. And the other thing is, partly because of the Western Civilization program, we have 25 members of the faculty in the history department, which is pretty high for a student body population that we have in terms of number here. My previous job, there was 1,400 students, and we had 4 history faculty. So what's great about here is that we have folks who are able to specialize in the way that they do. And so I think we offer to students a really wide array of courses and specialties, and we just have a lot of experts up and down this hallway that I think students can draw on. So it's great for me as a professor. I've got collegial colleagues who are experts in their field and just really accomplished, and I'm really proud of them.
As a group, it's interesting that it sort of spans a pretty broad period of time. There are a number of you who are sort of new in your careers, and also another group who have been here long enough that I had them in class. Dr. Grace and Dr. Sickinger,
Sure.
Dr. O'Malley, people like that. So that's kind of an interesting dynamic, it seems.
Interesting dynamic. And I've been here now 8-9 years, and I've really kind of seen that transition. There were folks on the faculty like Richard Grace and Paul Quinlan and Jim McGovern and all kinds of folks who were stalwarts in the department when I arrived, and they've all moved on. And so we've seen a real kind of transition. And it's been good in some ways, and it's also a little sad, and it's bittersweet. Yeah.
Let's talk about your students. We'll get to your scholarship in just a minute, but you teach a lot. What is it that sort of characterizes your students, and what is it about them that inspires your work?
Part of why I love this job is that I get to be around young people, and I never have a day where I wake up and I don't want to come to the classroom and teach, and I think that's a real reflection of them. The students here at Providence, if you ask me to characterize them, are, I think, enthusiastic. I think they are a very respectful group to us as faculty members, but they're really eager to learn. And one of the things that I always tell folks when we interview for new professor positions and so on, they're very, I think, open to being challenged, and I think you can push them. And so when I'm sort of on the fence about assigning a certain text or a certain assignment, I think, well, gosh, this might be too much. It's never too much, and I think they'll rise to the challenge, and I think that's really a distinguishing hallmark of our students. You're active in the college community, or regular in the fitness center. See you at the basketball games with Professor Tom Strasser, and involved in a lot of things. It seems that you enjoy being part of the college community. I do 100%, and I'm glad that you said that I go to the fitness center. I can't say that if you see me around campus, it seems to match up with that, but I do attend. And yeah, Dr. Strasser's my great buddy. We have season tickets for the basketball games, and so I actually, as soon as I got the job at Providence, I think the first thing I did was buy season tickets to the basketball games, and then Tom and I kind of went in on them maybe 4 or 5 years ago. It's just been great. Do you think that your ability to connect to a community like this relates to the fact that you went to a similar college yourself? I think so, yeah. I mean, I think I knew when I interviewed at Providence the kind of place that Providence was from my own experience and training and so on. But it's exactly the kind of place that I wanted to be. I wanted to be at a small liberal arts Catholic school. And so, yeah, no, I definitely had that familiarity. By the way, I recommend Professor Johnson is a good follow on Twitter, because you might uncover a gem once in a while, like one from a few months ago, I guess several months ago now in Chicago. You happened to encounter Kris Dunn. I did. I was there for the American Studies Association meeting, and I was walking back after some sessions to my hotel on Michigan Avenue, and I was on the phone with my wife, and I said to her, hold on, I got to go, it's Kris Dunn. And so I hung up on her. She wasn't that mad once I explained later, and I said to Kris, hey, Kris, I teach at PC, and he came over. And we chatted for a while, and I said, can I get a picture? He said, absolutely. He didn't rush it. We did something right at Providence because he was very kind with me, and took his time. And then I think my phone died, and then there was a whole, it was just a comedy of errors, and he was really gracious on the street. It was really nice. Let's turn our attention to your scholarship. And among your specialties is radical politics in the American West around the beginning of the 20th century, the Progressive era. It's interesting that something like that is so specific. How do you come to an interest like that? Yeah, I think that partly comes out of graduate school training and, kind of finding your niche in social history and finding a topic that maybe we haven't told, which I think is partly how historians are at their best when we're telling stories that we haven't told. So you kind of find your niche. And I was really interested in the historical underdog. I was really interested in radicalism because of what it might tell us about main currents in American history. And so I went down this path of kind of thinking about the Socialist Party, people like Eugene Debs and so on, and then had this eureka moment where I realized, well, no one had ever done anything on the Socialist Party or radical politics in the Pacific Northwest. So in Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Western Montana. And that was a place where radical politics resonated with people who worked in, mining and timber and those kinds of things. So it was a logical fit. And so I kind of went down that path, and I've sort of never left that. It was partly accidental, I suppose. And now that's kind of where I live and breathe, is 19 teens. Let's explore that concept that you referenced there, radicalism
and what it tells us about main currents in American history. What kinds of things have you observed about that as you follow that line through?
Yeah, I think that when you think about radical labor, for example, in the late 19th to the early 20th century, or radical politics, the logical question to ask is what does that tell us about what was happening in terms of the mainstream? What were they reacting to? And so they hold significance because the bigger world around them was happening and significant and mattered. And so I think that those are not marginalized, they had been marginalized, but not insignificant stories, but they're important stories for what they tell us. What are they reacting to? Well, they're reacting to a widening wealth gap, for example. They're reacting to tensions about the world that they may have, and that may deal with class, but that may be dealing with other things too. And so it gives us a really valuable lens, I think, into looking into the past.
Are there observations that you can surface with respect to parallels to what we see today? Certainly the progressive era involved radicalism in response to societal factors. Yeah. Anything that we can point to that we see around us now?
Yeah, I think so. Progressivism and the progressive period is really hard to put your thumb on, but there were a few characteristics, and I think one of them was thinking about social justice and the way that we can kind of make the world a better place. Progressives believed in that, and I mean progressives in that early 20th century sense. We talk about it politically now, and those aren't always the same, but sometimes they are. A belief that the role of government is important in making the world a better place. They really thought that in the early 20th century. The value of mutualism is what they would have called it at the time, or kind of cooperation, that's something valuable. So I think there are parallels to that. Those are similar questions to the same things that we wrestle with today. And I just mentioned it a minute ago, but if you think about the wealth gap and those kinds of things, in some ways that data suggests that we're not much farther ahead than we were at the early 20th century. So I think those are nagging problems that we continue to wrestle with.
You wrote a book about the San Francisco Preparedness Day Bombing in 1916. In fact, your lecture on that subject was broadcast on C-SPAN about a year and a half ago, which was a great thing for the college to advance the institutional brand. It was really well received by C-SPAN and people who watched it there. Interesting, similar to what I surfaced with you a moment ago about something very specific. Can you tell us that story about what happened that day, that Saturday in 1916 in the summer, and how that became something that you fleshed out to the extent that it became a book and a subject that's so interesting to you?
Yeah. I think the second part of the question is where I'll start. And it actually the idea for that book came out of a meeting with a student that I had. We have a class called History 100 in the history department. And it is thinking and writing about history. And a student came to me and was thinking about writing about the LA Times bombing in 1910, and I thought, well, that's an interesting topic. That's kind of in line with some of my interests. And I started to poke around a little bit, and there had been some scholarship on it. And through that path, I got led to the 1916 Preparedness Day bombing. So what happened was on July 22nd, 1916, there was a Preparedness Day parade. And this was something that was happening during World War I as folks were really divided about whether or not we should be involved. And there were a lot of national leaders saying, if we are, we should be ready, Teddy Roosevelt among them and some others. So all over the country, they had these parades to show patriotism and support and readiness. And San Francisco was no different. Unfortunately, when that parade happened, a bomb exploded and ultimately killed 10 people. And what the story kind of tells us is that it became a story much more than that really kind of tragic act, because it started to be about really a battle over kind of I think kind of the course of American history in some ways. And the way that it became so significant was the powers that be in San Francisco tried to implicate local labor union leaders. And ultimately, one character went to jail. His name was Tom Mooney in 1916, and he didn't leave jail until 1939. And this is sort of a spoiler for the book. I still hope folks will read it. One of the real powerful parts of it is that he wasn't implicated. And there was doctored evidence, perjured testimony, and sort of pre-Photoshop work with photos and so on. So it became this kind of larger struggle that I think the United States was dealing with. And again, local folks in power were looking to strike a blow at radical labor and really stick it to them. And it was a great miscarriage of justice.
I was watching the lecture again yesterday on C-SPAN, and I was struck by your ability to tell a story. So in some sense, I suppose, history and the way we recount it is stories. You started that lecture by talking about a family that came over from Oakland and became part of that. When you develop scholarship or prepare a lecture, do you conceptualize it in that way, in terms of being a story that you're trying to convey to your audience?
So I think I try to tell the story, and it's very nice of you to say that, but I try to tell the story the way that some of my heroes tell stories. There are people in the business who are really good at it. You know, Eric Larson, who wrote the book Devil in the White City, or some other books where they're able to draw you in. I think you're able to get to that point by telling good detail. And so what drives that is the research. And so I had to poke through accounts of that day and find the story of the Wymore family, who had traveled very innocently from Oakland, California to San Francisco with their 2 young children for the parade. And so I was able to find just these little snippets in reference to who they were and how they had gotten there and so on. And of course, they become part of this much larger tragic story. So that's how the book begins, because it puts, I think, a more sort of human face on this, right?
And that comes from painstaking, detailed research, right?
It does, and it's I love it, and I think a lot of my colleagues do too.
In April, you were involved in a program that caught my eye and that I found very interesting. You went to Texas as part of a National Council for History Education initiative, there you worked with K through 12 teachers to share some of your specific expertise so they could take it to their classrooms. How did that come about, and what was that experience like for you? Yeah,
it was a really fun project, and it's actually still ongoing. How it came about is one of my colleagues, his name is Mark Johnson, no relation, is at Notre Dame. And he reached out to me because he was coordinating this project where high school teachers who teach, AP kind of level history courses are building lesson plans and so on. And it became a collaboration, and I know they've done this for a few years, where college professors are brought in as scholars, and what happens is the teachers read in advance a copy of their recent work. So the San Francisco book from 1916, they got an advance copy of that. They had read it, and they had started kind of brainstorming about how they might teach it and what paths it may or may not lead them to. So I went to San Antonio and gave a kind of introductory talk, and there were other teachers who hadn't read the book about it. And then we did this kind of small group workshop to start thinking about, okay, what directions might this story take you? And it was pretty fascinating because they weren't necessarily the paths that it might lead you. Anti-immigrant attitudes, for example, kind of come out in the book, but some teachers sort of latched onto that, and then they're starting to do that. So what's really great about this project, and they work very closely, the National Council of History Education was the conference, and it's a program called Teaching with Primary Sources. And what will happen is we will reconvene at the Western History Association, which is one of the conferences I usually go to each year. We will reconvene, and the teachers will come back with some new ideas and so on, and we'll collaborate between now and October.
Hats off to those teachers, too, right? Because teachers are busy, they have hard jobs, and to take this extra step to deepen their understanding of the subject, good for them. Yeah,
it was amazing, and I'll tell you, I showed up, not only had they read it, but they were teaching me a lot of things that I didn't know, so it was great. It was really helpful.
Let's talk for a moment about the graduate programs. You will become the director of the history graduate programs in a few days. Tell our audience what programs PC offers in history graduate programs, what kind of people enroll, and what they can gain from these studies. Yeah, it's great. I'm really excited to take it on. My predecessor is the incomparable Dr. Paul O'Malley, who's been doing it for 23 years, and so hats off to him, and we've been chatting about the program and so on, and I'm excited to do that. It's a program for students interested in doing a master's degree in history. And given the quality of faculty I think that we've got at Providence, we can staff a really high-quality graduate program. And the kind of students who take the courses, it's around 10 courses, they are sometimes high school history teachers who are looking to advance their own training and so on, and so on. And then sometimes we have students who are interested perhaps in going on to a PhD. So it's a terminal, we'd say in the business, a terminal MA program.
But we have placed a number of students in PhD programs, so folks who kind of want to make a go of it as a professor. So that's kind of the program and its scope.
Does their presence, or what does their presence do, I should say, to enhance the life of this department and the interactions with faculty? What does that do with regard to the overall history faculty and program here?
Yeah, I think it's great, and I think we can do more and really kind of create and foster a greater visibility of graduate students at the department and on campus and so on. But I know that they've been active, for example, teaching or talking anyway and lecturing in the Making History conference that happens and so on. I'd like to see some more of that, and I know that they've also been active in attending events and lectures on campus and so on during the year. So yeah.
Let's talk about fictional depictions of the Old West.
Okay.
You spent time when you were growing up and in college in Montana and Wyoming, so sort of the sweet spot, South Dakota too, for many of these great stories. First, in a general sense, what is it about stories from the American West that gives them life, and what makes them such an enduring part of our sort of fictional vocabulary?
Yeah. Well, maybe in the broader sense, I think, we are fascinated as Americans with notions of rugged individualism. We are fascinated with open spaces and geography and all of those kinds of things that can offer a lot to us. So I think that is partly the allure. There is a mythology, of course, about the American West that has evolved over time, and there are problems with that. But something about those images of the West draw us into it. I mean, it is vistas, so it is that, again, geography, it is that topographical part and piece, and open spaces. Montana, after all, is big sky country. And I mean, the sky is not any different than Rhode Island, but it is bigger, that's for sure. And there is that part of it. There is also that, again, that kind of values part. The rugged
good guys, bad
bad guys. Again, the individualism part. So we've kind of fostered all of that, and I think it's the people too. And I think when you interact with folks from the West, it's just frankly different than someone from the American South or the East or anywhere.
What are some of the problems that mythology causes?
There are lots of them because it gives us, and this is partly this fictional issue, it gives us a snapshot of the American West that, and I hate to squash dreams, and I do this sometimes in class, that is not really the authentic West, right? In terms of race and in terms of class and in terms of gender, those images of guys in white hats, and usually white guys in white hats, is not quite the picture, in fact, of the real authentic American West. Most quote-unquote cowboys weren't white guys, and that's true. And most cowboys didn't own their own house, the ranch, or a horse. The ranch instead owned the horse. And the image of the gunfight at the drop of a hat sort of idea, that also, quite frankly, just didn't happen. Even though we love to think that it did, it just wasn't as commonplace as we've kind of romanticized.
Well, let's play a little game. I actually asked you to prepare for this, so we can go through this in 3 stages, book, movie, and television series.
Okay.
In this genre, what's your favorite book?
So my favorite book is, I'll choose a history book. And it's my favorite history book, and it's my favorite history book about the West. And it's a book called Big Trouble by J. Anthony Lucas, Lukas. And the subtitle to the book is A Murder in a Small Town Sets Off a Battle for the Soul of America. And Lucas was a journalist who originally wrote a book called Common Ground about the great kind of Boston busing crisis, won a Pulitzer Prize, I think, for that, and so on, and just a really gifted storyteller. Then he wrote this book in 1997 about a murder of a former governor of Idaho who had since retired, comes home to his house in 1905, opens up the front gate right before Christmas, and is killed by a bomb. This is because when he was governor, 6 years before, he had been hard on miners in the Coeur d'Alene district in northern Idaho, and they never forgot about it. And so that moment becomes the epicenter for this labor capital fight. Clarence Darrow shows up as one of the attorneys in Caldwell, Idaho, to defend Big Bill Haywood and a couple of other guys who were the heads of the Western Federation of Miners. Again, as I mentioned earlier, implicated as part of this much broader labor conspiracy. And it's an incredible story. It's 800 pages and a doorstop, but you will be well served to read it.
A recommendation from a professor. So considering what you do, the fact that you chose a history book, a work of nonfiction, that makes perfect sense.
Yeah,
a good idea.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
Not that you asked, but I thought about this too, and I'm going to take.
I'm interested.
I'm going to take Lonesome Dove.
Good.
The
Yep.
Larry McMurtry, epic, great story. Nobody puts a sentence together like Larry McMurtry, so it's just it's a beautiful read and one that I've read a couple of times. Also a long book, but certainly terrific, and I'm sure you've read that and like it too. What about a movie?
So I just went on this tirade about the mythology of the West and the way that the West is portrayed and so on. But let me indulge in one that actually falls into a lot of those traps, and it's Tombstone. I just love that movie, and there are lots of problems with it. Doc Holliday didn't kill lots of folks, for example, and but what an incredible movie, and it really fits in that genre. And there's such memorable lines, and I still think Val Kilmer was cheated out of an Oscar for that film. So,
and of course, the most famous line: "Tell them we're coming, and hell is coming with us."
That's right. Yeah, exactly. That's right. Yeah,
Kurt
exactly. What's your favorite Western movie? Can you think of one?
Oh, absolutely. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid.
That's right.
Yeah,
that's right. That's the old Robert Redford, right?
Robert Redford.
That's right.
Yes, and Paul Newman.
Newman, right.
Ended with them jumping off the cliff.
Yep.
I can't swim. No, don't worry. The fall will probably kill you anyway. So
That's right.
Great stuff.
Yep.
And television?
It's probably for TV, Deadwood. And what I liked about that is, I think I would choose that because, the writing was so incredible, but it really did make an earnest effort to demonstrate and show an authentic West. What were those places like in the 1880s? I think the grit is there in that. How about you?
Same one.
Really?
Same one. And when you were talking about the issues with the mythology and the depiction of white people and all that, it occurred to me that Deadwood might be something that does break some of that. You have the Asian population in Deadwood, for example, and some other things going on there. So interesting that thread follows through.
That's right. You've got Mr. Wu, who's a great character in that show. That's right. And a real and authentic kind of piece of life in those places. Butte, Montana is another place where the Asian community was a huge piece of the life of those places, and in some ways still to this day. Yeah.
Interesting that these types of stories they never stop coming along. I happened to spot something on Twitter or somewhere the other day. There's a new series starting very soon with Kevin Costner, and I don't even know what it is or where it is, but it's a Western.
All right.
So
well, you'll have to let me know about it. Okay. All right.
I'll have to check it out and see how it goes.
All right.
So, that's good. Well, Jeff Johnson, thank you so much for your time. This has been a lot of fun. We appreciate this, and we should come back and pick up on some of these themes a little bit later, maybe a little while down the road, because there's a lot more to explore here.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for having me. It's been an honor.
Jeff Johnson has been our guest, and we'd like to thank you for joining us today. You can subscribe to the Providence College podcast at all the usual places, and they're available on the college's YouTube channel. Feedback is welcome at podcast@providence.edu. Thanks to our producer, Chris Judge. I'm Joe Carr. Until next time.